Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Alabama and to our Steiner Lecture, sponsored by the University of Alabama Museums. I'm Bill Bomar. I'm the Executive Director of the University Museums. I want to thank you for being here today and welcome you to what is our second lecture of the John S. Steiner Lecture Series hosted by UA Museums. Many of you attended our first Steiner Lecture last year when we had Dr. David Schiffman speaking on Why Sharks Matter. I think you're going to really enjoy our speaker that we have today for this year. The goal of this lecture series is to bring together respected scholars on the campus of the university to speak on topics of interest not only to the university community, faculty and students, but the public at large, the general public, people of all ages. UA Museums is a museum system consisting of 4 public museums: the Alabama Museum of Natural History here on campus, the Gorgas House Museum, the oldest structure here at the university, the Paul W. Bryant Museum here on campus, Roll Tide, and Moundville Archaeological Park located 13 miles south of Tuscaloosa. We also have 2 research departments and the very popular television show Discovering Alabama. We cover a broad array of disciplines across our museums, and the goal of this lecture series is to bring scholars to campus whose work relates to the disciplines that we emphasize in our museums. So future speakers may include biologists, archaeologists, paleontologists, or historians. This lecture series is made possible by a generous gift from John Steiner, who's with us today with his family. John and his family love museums of all kinds. John appreciates the unique role that museums at universities in particular play in connecting academic research with broader audiences. John's an active member of our Museum Advisory Board, the UA Museum's Board of Regents, and he also has endowed a scholarship for graduate museum studies students at the university. Several of our students are here today. John is right over here. John, could you stand and be recognized? And let's give him a round of applause. Thanks, John. I just also want to make just an announcement. After the program is over today, you are all invited to a reception over at the Alabama Museum of Natural History. We'll have people directing the way in the grand gallery there, and so we'll have food and refreshments and drink, and you'll have a chance to interact with our speaker today, and we'll also have some books for sale if you're interested in that. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jason DeCaro, the Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and he's chair of the Anthropology Department.
Well, thanks, Bill. So it is absolutely my pleasure on behalf of Dean Messina and the entire College of Arts and Sciences to warmly welcome you all to the Steiner Lecture today. And it is also my immense pleasure to warmly welcome our guest of honor and guest speaker to join us today, Dr. Jan Šimek. I can guarantee you that you are in for a tremendous treat today. We were fortunate enough yesterday in the Anthropology Department to host Dr. Šimek for a couple of hours where he spoke to students, faculty, and shared some of his work. And it was absolutely entrancing. Let me tell you, the only problem was that people didn't want to stop asking questions. And Matt Gage had to sort of like drag him out of there before he was there until midnight. So again, thank you for being here. This is a great treat. And let me now introduce Matt Gage.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? First off, thank you to the Steiner family. This is a wonderful, wonderful scenario. You guys really have done a fantastic job with bringing lecturers in, and we can't thank you enough. And again, I just want to give you a round of applause for all you've done for this university. All right, I'm going to try to keep my comments pretty short because Jan will yell at me if I don't. So Jan is the chair of my dissertation committee, and I've known him for since the 90s, when Jan came down to interview for a job at the University of Alabama. Unfortunately, we were not successful in getting him to come here, but instead he went on to bigger and better things at the University of Tennessee. not only serving as the chair of the anthropology department, but then becoming the chancellor of the University of Tennessee Systems, going on to become the president of the University of Tennessee. And the most important thing in his long list of credentials to me is a distinguished professor of science. And that's an amazing achievement, particularly for an anthropologist. So we are considered sort of, we're called the cowboys of science, and I don't know if that's correct, but Jan is definitely a cowboy. Just very quickly, I started the program at the University of Tennessee in, I guess it was the fall of 2005. And I also started a large project for Tennessee Valley Authority at the time, spending all my winters out on the reservoirs looking at archaeological sites. And Jan and a group of us went out to look at some rock art on Wheeler Reservoir in 2007. And Jan pulled me aside and he said, "I've got something to tell you." And I thought, this is going to be terrible. They're going to kick me out of the department or something. I'm not getting my credits in time or something. And he said, "I'm not going to have any time for you. I'm about to become the chancellor of the University of Tennessee." And I thought, okay, well, that's not a big deal. I'm self-motivated. I can do all this on my own. Well, now it's 2024. I am still not done with my dissertation, and I blame Jan for all of that. So without further ado, please let me introduce Jan. It's my distinguished pleasure to do so, and Jan Shimmick.
Thank you, Matt. It's not anywhere near as dramatic as he's making it out to be. Although the story of me telling him that I couldn't really work hard on being his dissertation chair for a while because I was going to go into higher level administration is true. So, yeah, it was. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here. Not my first time at the University of Alabama, of course. Who said it first? I guess Bill said I came and did an interview here many years ago in much younger days. That didn't work out. And I've been back periodically since because obviously the archaeology here is extraordinary. Moundville is an incredible place where Matt has his center. And it's always been an extraordinary experience for me to come down and talk with my colleagues here at the University of Alabama. We have a great deal of respect for each other and always have. We are, in many ways, University of Tennessee and University of Alabama are the two oldest and sort of primary southeastern archaeology schools. And we started close to the same time and kind of developed in close to the same way. And so that connection has always been very, very strong. So yes, what I'm going to talk to you about today is archaeology, the Steiner Lecture Series, and it is an extraordinary and a generous thing for you to have established, has a wide range of topics that it looks at. What I'm going to talk to you today about, really more than anything, is history, but the history as informed by the archaeological record. The archaeological record, for those of you who've not heard that term, is what people leave behind that we can find and look at and try to determine how it was produced, what it means in terms of past human behavior. It can be anything from potsherds to temples. All of that is part of the archaeological record. What I'm going to talk to you today about is writing. Writing that we'd never expected to see, that I certainly wasn't looking for when we found it, but writing that opened a door to what, at least in my view, is an extraordinary archaeological discovery and has created the opportunity for collaboration, for cooperation between groups of people who historically haven't done that very much. And by that, I'm talking about Native American people and archaeologists. Those are two entities that have seen lots of resentment, lots of friction. In many ways, neither side looked very favorably on the other. But in the project that I'm going to describe for you today, we had the opportunity to really focus on what we shared together in our scientific enterprises. What I'm going to talk about is Cherokee Syllabary. and it occurs to me perhaps I should define that term a little bit, and I'm going to talk about its history. A syllabary is a writing system that is formed based on the syllables of a language. We use an alphabet that's formed based on the letters, and we construct sounds from those letters that include syllables at a certain point. A syllabary, though, focuses the symbolic representation on the syllables themselves. There are not many of those in the world, in fact, but there are a few. And the history I'm going to recount for you here in a few minutes is a history that saw a brilliant Cherokee scholar in the middle part of the 19th century develop a writing system for his people that he saw best served in the format of a syllabary. And we call it the Sequoian syllabary because the person who did this was a man named Sequoyah, or the Cherokee syllabary, more widely. And I'll talk more about it later. It is a representation, a written representation of the Cherokee language. The Cherokee language is an Iroquoian language, Native American, Eastern Woodlands Native American language, but one that relatively few people speak today, in fact. Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian schools, missionary schools worked very hard in the 19th and early 20th century to kind of get the language out of Cherokee people, both those that remained in the Southeast and the great majority who were ultimately moved to Oklahoma. Nevertheless, there are some speakers still alive, and there's a Cherokee revitalization movement going on now to try and bring the language back, especially to the children. It's a great thing to watch. So there are people who can speak Cherokee, and there are a few people who can read it. I am not one of those people that can do either one. I am, and I'll make this disclaimer right at the start, I am a white European American who has no aspirations to any Cherokee ancestors. I needed Cherokee people to work on the material that we found in these caves. And so what this talk will be about in a more general sense. It's about the history, and it's about how the physical material that gets left behind reflects that history. But more than anything, it's about how Native Americans and white scholars can join together and create a much richer and more textured understanding of the Native past in North America than we ever could separately. There are just skills that each group has that can benefit the other. And it's been an extraordinary experience, this project, to undertake because of that more than anything else. So I didn't do this alone, is the point of this title slide. I did it with 3 scholars from various Cherokee groups today and a photographer from Atlanta who is the greatest cave photographer in North America today, Alan Kressler. The Cherokee scholars are 3, and they come from, so when the United States government removed people from Eastern North America, and we'll talk about that, came to be called the Trail of Tears, they moved people in bodies to what at the time was called Indian Territory, and today is called Oklahoma. And we both can beat Oklahoma, let's be honest. So as they accomplished those removals, the Cherokee people that they removed ended up in 3 primary groups. 2 ended up in Oklahoma. The Cherokee Nation, the largest group, who were removed from Alabama, from Tennessee, from Georgia, from South Carolina, and are still the largest group. They have their tribal headquarters today in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. There are well over 300,000 Cherokees in the Cherokee Nation. A smaller group that had actually left on their own from the Eastern Woodlands rather earlier on and moved to Arkansas first, went across to the other side of the Mississippi River, and then went on as the bulk of the Cherokee Nation was moved to Oklahoma, went on and joined them. They're called the United Kidua Band. They were called the Old Settlers at the beginning, but now they're called the United Kidua Band. And by the consideration of the federal government, They are a separate tribal entity. They don't see it that way, they're all Cherokees, but they all speak the same language, come from the same groups of people, but it's the history of their actual displacement that led to their designation as separate federally recognized tribes. The third group still lives in North Carolina, in the homeland. They're the smallest group. They're called the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. If you go to the Great Smoky Mountains and cross over into the North Carolina side, you come to Cherokee. That's the Eastern Band. They remained in the homeland against all odds because they did not live on land that the federal government considered Indian land. They had bought the land, fee simple, for dollars, and had transferred its ownership to a white community member named Will Thomas, who held that land in their name. And when the federal government forced the Cherokees to sign treaties to cede the land, that land was not ceded because it wasn't tribal land. They're still there. And they've been there since the removal. They have very close ties to the Oklahoma tribes, but they are a third federally recognized tribe. Okay, that's the current structure. So my colleagues here represent all three of those groups. So a voice of all the Cherokee tribes takes part in this project. Bo Carroll is the archaeologist aside from me in this group. He is the chief archaeologist, the principal archaeologist for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, lives in North Carolina. He is also a PhD student, moving along fairly well, as is Matt, at the University of Tennessee. I'm retired from the University of Tennessee, except for Matt and Bo. His interest is he's actually working on these caves that I'm going to describe to you as part of his dissertation research. He is a Cherokee speaker. He's also a religious specialist, because there's aspects of this, as we'll go along, you'll see, have to do with sacred ideas. Tom Belt is simultaneously an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and the United Kidua Band, because he has parents or grandparents from both groups who got married, and he's from Oklahoma. Tom is retired now, but for most of his career, he directed the Cherokee language program at Western Carolina University, which is the closest university to the Eastern Band of the Cherokees, and is part of this language revitalization process that the tribe has undertaken. And Julie Reed is my great and good colleague. She was a junior faculty member at the University of Tennessee in the history department. She is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and her specialty was in particular, the so-called old settlers that became the United Kidua Band, although she is a member of the Cherokee Nation, and her ancestors came from the Arab area of Alabama that I'm going to talk to you about here. But the old settlers were an interesting historical entity, and she's done a great deal of historical work on it. Her expertise is pure history, documentary history. She is not a Cherokee speaker. She can read the language to a bit, but her real expertise is the historical context of what we're going to talk about. So, Cherokee speaker and expert in reading the language, Cherokee speaker and learning how to read the language from him, and me and Alan, basically, and Julie are what this team involves. So there's a lot of Cherokee input here, and as you'll see, there needs to be. This is not archaeology with me as the chief archaeologist and them as the sort of specialists. That kind of archaeology, in my view, is long dead. Archaeology is a collaborative process where everybody contributes, everybody defines the research strategy, the directions, and carries it out. It's a lot more fun that way, to be honest with you, and you do better work. So we are equals in the work that I'm going to present to you. As I said, a fair amount of it is being carried out under Bo Carroll's doctoral dissertation, and so the publications that we've had so far and the one that's coming out soon are under his his lead name, because he's a graduate student, need the publications. Okay. So those of you that aren't familiar with the Native American context of the Southeast at the time that European expansion began to come into the area that is today Alabama, that area had a long and complex Native American history that goes back to the end of the Ice Age. We don't know who those people were. We do know that they were Native Americans, and in all probability were the ancestors of the many groups of people that were here when Europeans arrived. The groups that were here when Europeans arrived that were themselves varied and not all friendly. You had a group of people, probably the largest and maybe the oldest group of people, who spoke languages within the Muskogee language family. We know them as Creeks or Muskogees or Alabamas or Uchis. They were, there's a good chance, the original inhabitants of much of the Southeast. There were, a little bit further to the north, there were groups that themselves admit came in fairly late in the historical process. Also, Muskogee speakers are close to it, but they're what today we refer to as the Chickasaws and the Choctaws. They have stories among themselves of crossing ice sheets and walking across the great American plains, hunting elephants, and coming to this part of the old world. That's a pretty good description of what archaeologists tells us happened back at the end of the Pleistocene. Again, to the north, Shawnee people occupied this area as well, crossed into Kentucky. So there was a lot of diversity, and then a whole bunch of smaller groups of people that were related in some ways to these. The demographic structure of the American Southeast was very, very complicated. But late in the process, it's not clear entirely when, historically, probably sometime after 1000 AD, and maybe several hundred years after that, Cherokee people made their way into the Southeast. And as I said, they were Iroquoian speakers, completely different language family than the people who lived here, and almost certainly came from further north along the eastern seaboard. They will admit this. But they also argue that they came out of the ground at a place called Kadua in Cherokee, a location that can be identified, that once they had built a casino in Cherokee, North Carolina, and began to accumulate some wealth that they could use, the first thing they did was buy Kadua. And that is their origin. So Cherokee scholars will admit to two origins, a scientific one and an emotional one, a spiritual one. And I'm not going to sort that one out. We'll get a little bit of indication, though, of both of those things as we look at what we find in these caves. By European arrival, the Cherokee people, who were at the time populous and warlike, and pitched battles frequently with their neighbors and with the whites when they showed up. The Muskogee in particular have a long history of warfare with the Cherokee people. They claim an area that you see here. So northwestern South Carolina, northern Georgia, northern Alabama, the central and eastern part of Tennessee, all of Kentucky, a portion of West Virginia and Virginia, and a portion of western North Carolina. The homeland, the heartland, though, was the Appalachian Mountains here. Cherokee origin story says that at a certain point in time, a mud dauber fell out of the sky and went into the ocean, picked mud up out of the bottom of the sea. The sea was endless at the time, and it began to grow and form earth. And as it formed earth, it expanded and grew till the people who were up in the sky couldn't tell how big it was. So they sent a giant buzzard to figure out how big the world was. And the buzzard flew until he got so tired that his wings began to dip into the mud at the surface that was forming the new earth, and mountains were formed with his wings, and that's where the Cherokees lived. So they have this sense of place, this place, but the core, the heart, is Tennessee River to the east in that area. When Europeans arrived, I guess relations started out okay, but they deteriorated quickly because Europeans wanted land and Cherokees weren't going to give it up. And so a whole series of pitched battles were fought. Some of them, early on especially, very bloody. In the end, though, the might of European military force began to wear down the Cherokee people, and bit by bit, that land that you just saw was ceded by treaty to first the British and then to the Americans after the American Revolution. This shows the treaty cessions that occurred on that plot of Cherokee land beginning in the late part of the 18th century and extending up until 1823 in the 19th century. And the numbers you see on that is the order that the parcels were ceded. So, Georgia was particularly hard on this. Cherokees still don't like Georgia very much. None of us do in football, but in this, the Cherokees don't like them at all. And you can see the low numbers are there. As soon as they had the opportunity, the Europeans in Georgia began to evict, basically, the Cherokee people. They didn't remove them yet, so they moved into other portions of their territory. They moved into the heartland of the Tennessee Valley and the Appalachian Mountains, and they moved into what had probably previously been not so heavily occupied parts of Alabama, the Tennessee River in Alabama. A great Cherokee war chief, whose name was Dragging Canoe, had fought against the Americans on the side of the British during the Revolution. There's been a whole, actually, series of bad choices of who your allies should be that the Cherokees made over time. They fought for the Confederacy, too. That didn't work out. And that, not to impugn the Confederacy, but it didn't work out. But at this point, Dragging Canoe, the Europeans insisted that the Cherokees cede land and basically settle down and become farmers and do what the Europeans wanted them to. Dragging Canoe said, not on your life. He went to Alabama. And so a whole series of what came to be called Chickamauga settlements began to be developed along the Tennessee River in Alabama and in Georgia. It was a long, heartbreaking process. Here's the Chickamauga settlements, and you see the boundaries between Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama on this map. And the Chickamauga villages, communities, are labeled there as Long Island, Lookout Town, Nickajack, Running Water, Crowtown. There's one called Sequoia there that we'll talk about in a minute. Back in the heartland, you have Chickamauga itself, Sitico, Chattanooga, Tuskegee. Those were heartland Cherokee communities. So they come over Lookout Mountain, and they come down into the valley. And they're trying hard as they can to avoid white people, but they can't. They're followed by missionaries first. Baptists and Methodists, and a whole chain of missions get set up in this area, and they follow schools, and the Cherokees begin to get, or at least some of them get the sense that this is not going well, that they're going to have to find a way. Simply avoidance is not going to be successful. They're going to have to find a way to accommodate what the Europeans want them to do, which is become Europeans. And so they fragment politically among themselves into groups that are willing to work with the Europeans and sort of negotiate the best deal they can get, and groups, traditionalists, who will not. And our man Sequoia is among that latter group. Then he shows up. If you don't know who he is, look at a $10 bill. or the Jackson Bank of Jackson County of northern Alabama. Andrew Jackson, of course, becomes president of the United States and forces passage through Congress, literally forces passage through Congress because they don't want to do it, of the so-called Indian Removal Act of 1830. In that act, it is mandated that all Native American people on the eastern side of the Mississippi River will be removed forcibly, if necessary, to the western side. And land is allotted to them in Oklahoma, mostly in eastern Oklahoma, none of it in very good Oklahoma. It's not rich land, it's not the homeland. It is dry, it is occupied by the Osage, the Kaw, the Omaha, fairly fierce western tribes. And the idea is just get them over there and forget about it. Oil hadn't been discovered yet. That comes later and they take it back. But at this time, he begins to implement their removal. Jackson chooses to do it using the United States Army. They round up Native American people all across the East. The Cherokees are perhaps the largest and most famous group, but the Creeks are round up. Matt showed me yesterday a historical marker here in Tuscaloosa marking the location of an internment camp where Creek people were gathered together and moved off to the west. It happened all over the East. It's not just the Chickasaws and Choctaws and Cherokees and Creeks. It was also the Ojibwa and Passawatami, and everybody had to leave. And it was not, in the early stages, a happy activity. Army units were sent in, people were rounded up, put on wagons, taken first to these concentration camps, put on wagons, and dragged off in the wintertime. And 20,000 people died in the early days. It was a horror. It's called the Trail of Tears for a reason. That's not a political statement I just made, by the way. I put no value on it. It's what freaking happened. We have lots and lots of stories of people who, my ancestors escaped into the woods. No, they didn't. Nobody escaped this. It was concerted, hardcore Andrew Jackson at his worst, getting people out. But not in Kuala, North Carolina, because that wasn't Indian land. They didn't leave and didn't have to. And there are a few other such examples, but not many. A couple of groups of Alabama Coushatta people went down into Texas and southern Louisiana, and they're still there. It's not clear whether the old settlers in Arkansas could have stayed there. They probably could have, but they decided they'd rather go live with their people in Oklahoma. That's the context of the story I'm going to tell you from the archaeological point of view. In those Chickamauga settlements that I talked about along the Tennessee River in Alabama, the largest community there was a town called Willstown, named after a Scottish trader who had set up a trading post among those dragon canoes communities to trade with the Cherokee people who lived there. And so Cherokee people who had emigrated from the homeland, came into the Tennessee Valley in Alabama, and many of them, they settled at all of those communities, but many of them settled right around this trading post. One of the first places that the missionaries went. So in that community, very early on, there was a Methodist church and school and a Baptist church and school. And they began to proselytize. And that brought about this sort of schism I talked about with the traditionalists, kind of, as far as we could tell, moving to one part of the community and the people who were treating with the Europeans moving to another. And lots of very strange things happened socially and culturally through all of this. There was animosity among Cherokee people themselves, created by a context that they had nothing to control. But there were people who walked on the boundary. One of my favorite is that guy there, Spirit the Preacher. His white name was John Hus, a German name probably given to him by, he was actually an ordained Methodist minister, which is nice, and so he had a nice German name, but he almost certainly didn't practice his religion as a Methodist, because everybody in Willstown knew him as Spirit. So maintaining the old ways while giving semblance of the new was probably a fairly widespread activity. But there was a lot of tension, a lot of fear, a lot of mistrust among Cherokees themselves. And so if you were a traditionalist, A, you were in the minority by this time, and B, you probably had to be careful. That will play out in what I'm going to show you here in a minute. After the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, the U.S. Army came into Willstown, built a internment camp to remove the people from the surrounding area. The U.S. Army occupied Spirit the Preacher's house as its headquarters, with the internment camp right next to it, and named that military camp Fort Payne. And today we know it as Fort Payne, Alabama. Spirit the Preacher's house is still there, or at least the ruins of his house is still there. It's part of a Trail of Tears park that the city, county maintains and exhibits, as is the Methodist church and graveyard, the Baptist church and graveyard. And in a minute we're going to see as a cave that's on this property, or in this area. Beginning sometime around the turn of the 19th century, a Cherokee medicine man and artist named Sequoyah moved with his family from the area around Von Orr, Tennessee, which is about 30 miles south of Knoxville, on a line going to Chattanooga. If you've ever been over there, there's the Sequoyah Birthplace Museum. That's where he, so near there, was supposedly born. A man named Sequoyah moved to Fort Payne. He had, and not long after he got there, the United States Army moved south towards Alabama from Central Tennessee under the command of Andrew Jackson to attack the Red Stick Creeks to the south. And he joined up with the United States Army. The story goes like this. One thing I'll say before I go too far with this, the whole history of Sequoyah is complex because he was a very mysterious person. It's never clear whether he did the things that that were attributed to him. But in any case, the story goes that he watched as U.S. soldiers used written orders to communicate with each other over long distances, and realized that they could do this secretly and directly to the great benefit of all the people involved. Under military command now, he decided the Cherokees needed such a language. And so he began to develop, out of whole cloth, a writing system for the Cherokee people. It took him years, a couple of decades anyway, after he'd come back from the Creek Wars, but this is the first version of it that we have record of. It's in his own hand. This resides in the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's a remarkable thing to look at. It's like looking at the Constitution in certain ways. But it has two important elements to it. Each sound, each syllable in the Cherokee language has a symbol. And this is the one that he developed himself for the writing. And the symbol next to it is what they decided to use because his script was so complicated. And Cherokees very early on realized that this would be a great thing to be able to print, that they developed a print version that you could adapt the dies from a standard printing press without too much trouble and be able to print in Cherokee. So as it says, it's the print symbols paired with his handwritten symbols. We see both of these, in fact, in caves. By 1824, he had completed this. And here's the final version of the print version. The story goes that in order to prove to the Cherokee leadership that this was a useful thing, he took his young 6-year-old at the time daughter and put her in a room. And he stayed in another room, and the elders gave him a text to write down that they then carried into his daughter Aoki in the next room, who read it to them verbatim. You can imagine, they went, whoa. And within a year adopted it as the official Cherokee writing system. It was remarkably easy to learn. If you spoke Cherokee, the sounds are related across the top and down the side. So that in very short order, there are 86 symbols, but you could make every Cherokee word out of those 86 symbols according to almost a mathematical formula of how you did it. In 1826, the Cherokee tribe adopted this as their written language. By the removal in 1830, the estimates go anywhere from 60 to 70% to over 80% of Cherokee people were literate. I'm not sure we could brag that today, but they could. So it was that easy to learn and that pervasive. And they began to use it for everything. In Nuachoda, which was the ancient Cherokee capital in northern Georgia, still occupied, the last bastion of the Cherokee in Georgia, a printing press was set up by the Cherokee Nation government that began to print documents, newspapers, Bibles, all kinds of things in the Cherokee script. The Cherokee Phoenix was the first newspaper published in Cherokee, and if you look, it's both in English and in Cherokee, because they spoke English by this time very well, most of them. They all had English names because the government required them to. It was a remarkable development. In 1826, though, Sequoyah left to go live with the old settlers. He was gone. His family stayed behind in Fort Payne. This language today, the syllabary, you still see it. In Cherokee, North Carolina, go over there and look at every sign, every street sign, every store sign. Again, as part of the language revitalization program, they are keeping this written script, this syllabary, alive. And that brings us to Manitou Cave in Alabama. Manitou Cave is a deep cave that's been known actually by Europeans for hundreds of years in Fort Payne. It was a show cave, a tourist attraction for many years, established by mining companies in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. They made pathways, there's some very beautiful cave features inside there. And then it ran out of interest and went into disrepair and was abandoned. And we'd never gone in there until 2006. In 2006, a new owner purchased this cave, and we'd been forbidden to go into it prior to that, but Alan Kressler met with the new owner, said we'd really like to go in and look to see if there's prehistoric cave art in it. And she gave us permission, and so we went in 2006. I'll note just in passing here, we'll come back to it, that gate is a substantial gate, but it's new. The old gate was a steel plate that was just sort of hammered in there. People would breach it all the time. But this one was built because of what's inside. And it was also built with money from the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians who wanted to preserve what's inside, still do. We were interested because Alan, when he first talked to the owner and got inside, began to see evidence of pre-contact Native American activity in the cave. The simplest evidence are these black circles on the wall. Those are produced when you take a river cane torch that's burning for a light source and accumulating ash and knock it against the wall like you would a cigarette, or nobody does that anymore, but we used to have to do that, to get the ash off the end and continue the process of burning, letting oxygen at the end. If you don't do that, the torch goes out. If you do, it works really well. It leaves a very telltale sign. You can see the round form. Those are the river canes. We know that Native Americans used river cane torches. It's what they used. They've been around forever. River cane was an extremely rich resource. They used it for baskets, mats, walls, all kinds of purposes. Europeans, on the other hand, came from Europe with the habit of using pine pitch torches. They also went in caves, but it's really obvious the difference between the two. So when Alan saw this, we knew that Indians in the past had been in there. And he said, we need to come and look around. What we were looking for, what's up? It died. It died? No, it didn't. What we were looking for is this. For many years, what we call the Cave Archaeology Research Team at the University of Tennessee has been involved in exploring southeastern caves looking for ancient rock art on the insides of caves. The reason we do that is that in 1979, one of my colleagues, Carrie's professors, Charlie Faulkner, had responded to some information given to him by some local cavers about a cave, again between Chattanooga and Knoxville, that had drawings in it. And when he went, sure enough, it had hundreds of drawings in it. We're still working on the drawings in it. It's called Mudcliff Cave. They were traced into wet mud banks. And based on the presence of that, we started to do surveys all around the southeast, and we have well over 100 cave art sites today. A whole tradition of cave art production that was unknown prior to 1979. That goes back 7,000 years in some places. I worked in Europe for many years. I still do. It's not exactly Lascaux, but I'll put it up there. It's an artistic tradition of extraordinary richness and complexity. We look for it all the time because there's over 12,000 caves in Alabama and Tennessee alone, and we've been in 2,000 of them and have 100 caves. So we got lots to do. Some of them are so nasty, I'm not going in there. But Alan had seen this inside, and you can see the engraved lines, petroglyphs we call these, on the walls in the shape of, we believe it to be a bird with a wing coming down. The reason we believe that is that not all that far away, there's a cave site that has birds drawn very clearly on the inside of it. 20 or 30 of them in this site, also in Alabama. But you can see the pattern is the same. We have radiocarbon dates out of this cave that tell us that it's late prehistoric, pre-contact, for sure. So, Alan wanted me to go in and look at this other stuff. And as we made our way through, it was in the area where the pathways were prepared. It was, for me at my age and body mass, it was a great opportunity to have a nice, easy trip through a cave. But when we got to the end of all the arranged trails, there was a path that went off across a stream and up a really muddy passageway. And when we went up there, we began to see writing. And to be honest with you, when I first looked at it, my eyes just go past it because I'm looking for birds. And if there's writing there, I don't gestalt it properly. I don't read it until we sort of stopped at a point and said, what the heck is that? Because it's not English letters. I'd seen enough to know that it was probably syllabary. I didn't have a form with me to compare to it. But we took lots of pictures and went out and got those Sequoia syllabary sheets. And sure enough, it was syllabary writing. And at that point, we contacted Bo Carroll, Julie, and others and formed this research group to attack this cave and went back and began to explore looking for this. And we found a lot of it. Inscriptions all over the place. So here we had an opportunity, and we knew this, to deal with an archaeological record of past use of this cave in a format that we could understand, where the people who made this would speak to us about who they were and what they were doing. The birds, they're wonderful, don't get me wrong, some of them are fabulous, but we have to infer through archaeological interpretation processes We involve native people in that too, but still, it's always a guess. Here, it wasn't going to be a guess if we could find people that could translate. Tom Belt was the first person we talked to through Bo. And Tom said, I'm happy to work on translations. I'm not going in that cave. Okay. There were reasons for that. But Bo was willing. As I said, he's a ceremonialist as well. He knew what to do in order to protect himself from whatever difficult scenarios you might encounter in there. He was really interested in what these things said. Julie was willing to go anywhere and research the history of this area, so we had our team. And we began to document. It took almost 2 years to translate. This is the main and biggest panel that we saw. It's deep, almost a mile back inside the cave, in what we call the dark zone. There's no light back there at all. It's off the prepared trails, so historically no one ever went back there to see it. There were some footprints, so somebody did. But it was the place where there's a fairly substantial stream that flows from deep inside Manitou Cave out to the front. That formed the cave, ultimately, in the beginning. And this is where that stream comes out of the rock and begins its exposed flow to the entryway. It's very pure water. As it turns out, very powerful spiritually. The first thing, I probably shouldn't say it. Okay. So, Bo, and there will be things I won't say. Anthropologists understand this, because I've been asked not to. We're going to see this, there's some real powerful religious messaging here that is not for everybody's consumption. I'll give you as much as I can, according to them, but there will be big pieces, especially in a minute or two, that they don't want me to talk about. I know what it says, and it's really neat, trust me. But this was the first one that we began to interpret. Starts with a statement at the beginning in syllabary that says, these are the ones who lead, or we are the ones who lead. The second script, we lead the ball game. So most Southeastern tribes, most Native American tribes, played some version of what was called the ball game. You think of it probably like lacrosse. And the Iroquois, it's a lot like lacrosse. This, not so much. Cherokees called it the little brother of war. It was where two groups of people who were too close to each other to actually fight could act out their antagonism if they wanted to, because it's rough. I had the great opportunity when I was much younger. First started working with the Cherokees. They invited me to play in a ball game. I thought, God, what an amazing opportunity this is. This is great. Till I realized that you really don't want to be the only white guy playing it. And I'm not a little guy. I'm not huge, but I played football. You know, not here, of course. But I got my tail handed to me in the middle of that game. They just thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. There's a date, 1828, for this ball game. And the next line reads, in their month of April. And the last bit is the 30th day, April 30th, 1828. So we're being told what they're doing. We're being told we're being addressed by the leaders of the ball game, and they're telling us what day they played it. Hard in archaeology to get that kind of precision. It is. What I always find really interesting is that in their month of. Anybody want to guess who they is? We are they. Because the Cherokees don't have April. They were that acclimatized, that interaction. And it suggests that they didn't necessarily mean this not to be seen by white people. It was a public message, in fact. There are others that are not so much. But it's the ball game itself that is critically important here. It's a game. It can go on for days. It is also a ritual of renewal, of spiritual world renewal, that gets carried out through mimicking the action of war, the fighting of war with weapons. The sticks have no rules about what you can do with them. I can attest to that. They can beat your ass. And they enjoy it. It was a ritual that involved the game itself, which was a public display, but periodically the game would stop and the two teams would disappear into seclusion to purify themselves so that they could continue with this purification process, this renewal of the earth. And that renewal among the teams themselves always occurred under the leadership of a spiritual leader, and it occurred at a pure water source. It was actually a process called going to water. And I think I can say I've been taught to go to water in certain contexts where I need purification. This is one of them. It's a very simple ritual, but it's critical to cleanse the spirit so that you can go on with the critically important religious activity that's involved here. Then you go back out and whack on each other for a while and get bloody, and it goes on and on and on and on until the renewal process has been completed. They still do it today. Not just with me. This is in Cherokee, North Carolina, with two teams who know each other very well, who maybe want to act out a little bit of antagonism. They can do that. And you can see no armor, no pads, no helmets, and they are big dudes. The critical thing here, from the point of view of that inscription we looked at, is that it involves a religious leader. He is a spiritual man, a religious ceremonial specialist. I don't want to say priest, because that's not exactly what he is, and I don't want to say medicine man, because that's ethnocentric and stupid. He chants, he sings, he purifies, he scrapes them with turkey claws, he makes them bleed in order to let their blood do the purification, join with the waters that they are washing in. There are women involved, always, who dance and sing. They don't go to water. They probably didn't go into this part of the cave, but there is a big flat platform in the trail just outside, and they're probably out there as this is going on. And there are the players who represent the people in this activity. It is a deep and important ritual. So for all of us, as we examined this, it more and more gave us encouragement in how we had viewed the more ancient cave art, which we always thought was religious. But we had to infer that. We couldn't prove it. And yet here they were in historical times talking not about money, not about politics, but about religion and ceremony in the darkness of this spiritual place. So we kept looking, and we found more. Here's an inscription with a number of elements. This line reads, "We who are those who have blood coming out of their nose and mouth." The ball game wasn't necessarily going real well for this team. A second inscription, more personal. "I am a man or a respectable man or a man of authority." Again, it's the leader talking to us. It's that religious leader identifying himself. And he signs it. He signs it, Richard Guess. The top line reads Mr. R.G. in English, and the last name is his name, Richard Guess. So who's Richard Guess? Who's this spiritual leader that has taken these people into this cave? Signs the cave, in his name in the cave numerous times, always the same. To understand who Richard Guess is, we have to go back to Sequoyah. As I said before, Sequoyah had an English name that he actually used fairly commonly in legal documents with the United States government. He signed treaties on occasion. His English name was Richard Guess. Sometimes you see it as Gist, but that's a distortion. For him, his last name was Guess. Not Richard, George. So who else is in the Guess family? His first wife was a woman named Utiyu, and she lived and ultimately died early in the 19th century in East Tennessee. They had 5 children, all born in East Tennessee, but all made the trek with Sequoyah after Utiyu's death to Fort Payne. George Guest Jr., born in 1788, T.C. Guest, who actually became a beloved woman of Cherokee people when they went to Oklahoma, Polly Oyoka, who I talked about, that's the little girl who got the message and translated it, and his second oldest son, 4th born child, was Richard. Is it the same Richard? Short answer, of course, is yes, it is. How do we know it's the same Richard? Well, because we know from historical documents that Richard stayed in Fort Payne after Sequoyah had left. And when the removals began to occur, he helped Cherokees move their material goods to the west. In the early stages of the Trail of Tears, the United States government basically bundled people onto wagons, made them leave everything behind, and carted them off. So that when they arrived, if they arrived, in Oklahoma, they had nothing. No farm equipment, no building equipment, none of their personal items, their deeds, nothing. The Cherokees negotiated, John Ross, the principal chief of the nation, negotiated that let contract with Cherokee people to do the removal. We'll do it, but let us do it. And so the government agreed, and Richard became a contractor. So we actually have lots of his documents. This is a contract that Richard Guess signed with the U.S. government to move material from the southern part of the Chickamauga settlements down around Gunnersville, Crowtown, Turkeytown, and move people north with their material to a concentration camp, not in Fort Payne, that was further up on the Tennessee River near Nickajack. He got $16 for a number of truckloads of material, and he signed it. And there are a number of these. They all reside today in the National Archives. I'm not a handwriting expert, but I've had it looked at by handwriting experts. They say some of my best friends are handwriting experts, and it's the same signature. So the Richard Guess who signs the wall in Manitou Cave is Sequoyah's son. He is working to save his people. Sequoyah is off to the west, has crossed over the river. At this point, he's still with the old settlers, but eventually, at least one group of Cherokees who is trying to get to Oklahoma gets lost. And the rumor says that they divert their movement, they go down through Texas into Mexico and are gone, and nobody knows where they are. Sequoyah and 2 of his uncles go to try to find them. They never do, and Sequoyah passes away while he's down there. His grave ultimately is recovered from Mexico and brought back up in Oklahoma today. So here we have an archaeological record that is writing the late history of the Cherokees for us. We never could have gotten it if we hadn't worked very closely with Cherokee people to do it. So you all can choose. I can stop, but I have more caves if you want to see them quickly. Okay. I knew you would. Some of the other stuff is in Manitou Cave. So there are these documents of the ritual and of Richard Guess's presence as a religious leader in the cave. As we moved backwards and forwards through, we began to see more Cherokee inscriptions, away from where that one was, and in places that were far more difficult to reach, including 40 feet up on the ceiling of the cave. These inscriptions were nowhere near as detailed or elaborate, but they were way the hell up there. So that's Bo, Carol, and Alan Kressler trying to photograph it. And you can see the inscriptions off to the left of Alan, and we have no idea how they made those. Tom Belt, again a Cherokee religious practitioner, when we asked him how he thought that they made them, said, well, maybe they could fly. And I'm not arguing with him. These inscriptions were made at a slightly different time and have to do with a different subject. They are small inscriptions. Most of them begin with an address to spirit people called the Old Ones, who it's fairly clear the writer believes live in the rock. And I'll show you in a second why we think that's true. They are emotional and culturally very sensitive interactions. And I can't tell you what they say. Trust me. They're not about bleeding from the nose and mouth. But they are all addressed to the old ones, to these ancestors in the rock. There's some variability to them. You can see the one down here is charcoal drawn on the wall. Here's the one, it's off to the left there, your left there. It addresses the old ones as the grandfathers. And then has some statements that we can't give you. So here's the syllabary, at least the written syllabary version of what that inscription is. What do you see that's wrong here? They're backwards and upside down. They're a mirror image. And if they're a mirror image, who can read them? People in the rock. So they are addressing, by the way they're writing it, people on the interior of this space. Here's another one. This is one I showed you before. It's also upside down and backwards and speaks to the old ones. Here's another version of what I just showed you. This one's kind of elaborate. It has a cloud-like form around the outside of it. The interior was blackened with soot, and then it was scraped to produce the writing. It's a negative pictograph. It's up on the ceiling. I have no idea how they did this. None at all. Maybe they could fly. There it is, image enhanced a little bit. You can see it's the same thing as before. You are my ancestors. So, a second set of material that clearly deals with very powerful religious material, but not the same as the first one. And not done by the same people as the first one. Cherokees, yes, but I'm going to show you in a minute, not the same individuals. And so multiple ceremonial activities are going on in this space. Caves were sacred places. They were not to be taken lightly. They were not to be fooled with. There you see the enhanced version of that, backwards and all. These inscriptions on the ceiling are also signed. This is not the signature, that is. Those are two Cherokee syllables, Sasa. Sasa means the goose. We know who the Sasa was. He lived on Conasauga River about 60 miles from Fort Payne. He was a ceremonial man, but a recluse, hermit. He lived away from the communities. Richard Guest lived in the middle of them. There were two different kinds of ceremonialists. Sasa is dealing with the ancient spirits. We'll come back to him again in a little bit. This is not Sasa's house. It is a Cherokee's house. Anybody know what it is? So this is the Plantation Manor House that belonged to, I've blanked his first name.
John.
No, it's his brother. Ross,
William.
no, Anthony? John Ross's younger brother. The Ross family were the principal chiefs, but they were split in their politics. John Ross, who was the principal chief, was a traditionalist who wanted to stay and fought like hell. Most of the time he lived in Washington, actually, because he was working with Congress and the Supreme Court trying to get the whole Indian Removal Act overturned. His brother, though, was a plantation owner and had enslaved Africans at his beck and call, and was a treaty, what they called the treaty party. He signed the final treaty that led to the removal. He and his family went in luxury. I doubt the slaves did. But he was removed as well. This was his home, still stands in Fort Payne. You can see it. Huh?
Andrew.
Andrew, thank you. Yes, Andrew. And I'll just touch on this. This is his grave in Oklahoma. And you can see he was a signer of the New Echota Treaty, that last treaty that abandoned finally the land. When the removals were complete, the two factions of Cherokee society in Oklahoma began to punish each other. A civil war raged up until the United States Civil War for decades, with horrible events of mass slaughter. It was not a happy place. The only time it got happy was every once in a while, the Osage would try to drive them out and everybody would turn and attack the Osage. But what was going on was terrible. So he's treaty party. And you can see, he was killed that day in 1840. I've been able to find nothing to tell me how or why or in what context, except that he was a prime target for the traditionalist group, his brother's group. There's a cave on Andrew Ross's property, not far from the house. We're still in Fort Payne now. In that cave, in the 1830s, one of the local missionaries, a man named Daniel Buttrick, entered that cave with, I think, likely several Cherokee medicine people. And this is a page out of his notebook in the National Archives where he describes that visit into this cave. He claims that they saw the little people. The little people are Cherokee spirits of the forest. They are small but mean. They play tricks. They're not, evil killers. There's bunches of those in Cherokee with all you do, but they are tricksters. They are dangerous. And apparently, according to Buttrick, this is a Methodist missionary. Apparently they had taken up residence in this cave on the property of Andrew Ross. He describes the furniture that they had in there, etc., etc. We've been in this cave, and we didn't see any little people. We had Cherokees with us, and they didn't see any little people. Although there was a curious incident of an umbrella that was left supposedly in one place outside that was someplace else when we came out. But that's, we didn't see it, but we did see evidence that there had been furniture built in there that people had occupied it at some point or another in the past. And on the walls of that cave, members of the Ross family signed their names in English. For a long time, people said the Rosses couldn't speak Cherokee. There's good evidence that Julie's found in documents in Oklahoma that in fact they could, including John Ross, who spent so much time in Washington that people argued he just spoke English all the time as an American. Apparently he spoke Cherokee too. But they wrote their names in the cave in English letters. And there are several Rosses. This is a C. Ross, there's an R. Ross. But over the top of many of those signatures, remember this is a treaty party family, are Cherokee syllabary inscriptions, scraped on, always on the top, always the last thing placed in the cave. And I can't tell you what they say, but they are not, they are curses basically on the Ross family. This antagonism that plays out in the Cherokee Civil War begins back home. I want you to get a sense of just how horrible this was for these people. It destroyed for a long time their society. I actually was present when, for the first time, the two western groups of Cherokee came back to the homeland and joined with the eastern band of Cherokees and relit the fire for the first time in my lifetime, my adultness. So those antagonisms played out for a very long time. They may be not entirely healed. And these curses are imprinted over and over again inside this cave. People were not happy. As we began to look and realize that what we used to just sort of gestalt away, that's English writing, we don't need to look at that, that we really needed to go back to a lot of caves in this area and look at more. And sure enough, when we started to look, there are more. This is a cave called Howard's Waterfall Cave. It's in Trenton, Georgia, just across the Alabama line in Lookout Valley. It's owned by the Southeastern Cave Conservancy, who protects the Cherokee syllabary inscriptions that are in this cave. Bo and Tom and Julie also worked on this cave. It was the subject of a segment on PBS's Native America last year. If you saw it, the second episode, they talk about this cave and how these scholars are translating what's there. If you've never seen it, you can get it on the web. It's remarkable to watch how they work through this. Because some of the things that I've learned as we go along is that the Cherokee syllabary is a way of writing the Cherokee language, but the Cherokee language is not a monolith. That it had regional dialects. People said things in different ways and even gave different meanings. So if you're working through this, you can't just look at it and read it the way we would English inscriptions. You have to know who people are, where they're coming from, and what kind of Cherokee they spoke. That's why Tom especially is so critical here, because there's very few people that could do this. Howard's Waterfall Cave is a small inflow cave. There's actually small. There's 3 miles of passageway today, but 2.5 miles of that were actually dug open historically. It's famous, it's in Trenton, Georgia. It's famous because there was an event where a group of Boy Scouts went in at a time that there was a severe gasoline spill at a gas station above them, and the gasoline fumes descended into the cave and they were all asphyxiated. This is not one of the Boy Scouts. This is Alan Kressler, and he outright discovered these inscriptions. They were unknown until he went into the part of the cave where they were. And here's Bo looking at the panel of inscriptions in Howard Waterfall Cave. Again, they are significant enough that the Cherokee, Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians ponied up the money to build a impenetrable gate. It's never been penetrated, neither is the one in Manitou. These gates look the way they do because they're bat friendly. Old gates that are chain link or have vertical bars, bats won't go through because they need to know that their wings are going to clear the metal on both sides. I'll break this before time. So the Bat Conservation International invented these gates that bats can go straight into. And in both cases, bats have reoccupied caves that they abandoned many, many years ago. That's Kristen Bobo, who is the builder and welder that builds these things. She's that tall. She's sort of a little person, but an extraordinary construction engineer and builds these incredible gates that do great service in protecting these things. So Howard's Waterfall is outside of what today is Trenton, Georgia, right across the border. It was known in the past as Stokoe. And like most Cherokee villages, there wasn't a town. There was a scatter of settlements up and down the river that together agglomerated was the community. This cave was right in the middle of that community, still is today. The gate protects the Syllabary segment. No one is allowed in there except us with the Cherokees. That's the deal that we made. And here's the panel that we're going to look at. You can see it's an extensive panel like the one in the back part of Manitou Cave. So we'll start with this part. This is a question that's been asked about. This is something we're seeking an answer to. The second segment. We found it or them. So something's lost and somebody's looking for it, and they found it. We divided the product equally among the three of us. So there's 3 people involved in this, and there's 3 things that they find, that they're looking for. We're going to take back these 3 things because they're ours. We're going to satisfy the issue of possession. This is a particularly difficult inscription to translate. I haven't given you all of it, but I've given you the gist that has led these Cherokee scholars to interpret this as reflecting a tradition called blood vengeance. When members of a Cherokee community are killed, whether by enemies or as homicides within the community, the souls of those people cannot be at rest until they've been replaced by the souls of the people who did the homicide. It's hard news. My Cherokee colleagues insist, Bo especially, that it did a great job in the past of limiting homicide because you were going to pay for it. And you were going to pay for it fast, and it wasn't going to be pretty. But this inscription seems to represent, at least for the Cherokee scholars who interpreted it, a document of blood vengeance, of almost certainly medicine people. So it doesn't mean they actually went and killed somebody physically. They may have gone and killed somebody metaphorically, spiritually, through black magic. That's why I can't read you all of it, because you might go try it. Not a good idea. This is dark stuff. This is really different than we're the ball game and we're doing a good job or we're getting beat up really badly. This is the deep part of Cherokee religion, the dark part of Cherokee religion. It's always been there, still is there. But what's important here is that they're writing it on the wall of a cave. They're making it public. It's a warning in a certain respect, and a historical document. It's truly an amazing subject, but it adds another element to the ceremonial use of caves that we, working in the remote past with pictures, believed was at play. And everything we've seen so far in the cave suggests that it is. This one's signed too. Who's it signed by? The goose. Come up from Conasauga to lead a group of people on a blood quest. This is a dangerous man. And a religious figure clearly of great authority. Look at the richness of this. Archaeologists rarely can tell you who these people are, where they live, when they did it, and the kinds of activities in the religious realm that they're carrying out. This is what you get when you collaborate with Native people. Same signature exactly as there is on the ceiling in Manitou Cave. I'll finish with this, I promise. The more we look, the more we find. So these are the Trail of Tears routes out of Cherokee into Oklahoma over there, the Tahlequah region of eastern Oklahoma. As you can see, there were lots of pathways coming out of the homeland over here. The ones we're particularly interested in are these ones coming out of here. But the one I want to point out is the one that comes out of Fort Payne, goes to Huntsville, Pulaski, crosses the Tennessee border into Kentucky, comes out at basically Paducah, where those people get on a boat and float down the Missouri River into Oklahoma. That's called the Benj Detachment. They come out of Fort Payne. Their journey was long, but they were led by Cherokees. It was part of the Cherokee contracting, and they did pretty well. Most everybody got there. Where they cross between Tennessee and Kentucky, the Trail of Tears is still visible. You can see the pathway. It's all, at least locally, contained within a Tennessee State Park called Port Royal. It was a resting place for Cherokees being removed out of Alabama and then going on to Paducah, where they could get on the boats to go south to Oklahoma. To this day, Cherokee people have a bicycle ride out of the Eastern Band every year where they ride there. And they stop for several days. Right next to Port Royal, there's another segment of this park called Dunbar Cave State Park. This is Dunbar Cave. It's been known for a long time too. Roy Acuff owned it for a long time. It was called the Showplace of the South. They would bring country music acts out of Nashville north to Clarksville, which is where this is, in the summertime, because the cool air flowing out of the cave acted as a kind of a natural air conditioner to the crowds out on the dance floor. The dance floor is particularly important because it was made in the early part of the 20th century, and underneath it are 4.5 meters of archaeological deposit that are undisturbed, that go all the way from the Mississippian period at the top, the last prehistoric phase in the eastern woodlands, to the Ice Age in the bottom, and human occupation all the way down. If I was a younger man, I'd rip that concrete out after. Thank goodness I'm not. But you can see there's the dance floor, the concession stand. Acuff had a real operation going there. But the cave itself is 11 miles of underground passageway. And it had prehistoric art in it, paintings, that you can go see. It's open to the public, it's a state park. They will take you on a closely controlled tour to see the paintings on the walls of Dunbar Cave. Mississippian artwork of Mississippian symbols and warriors, and it's really, really a cool thing. We did the work that identified and then documented that stuff. But as you move through the cave, there's other writing on the walls in syllabary. This is different than the syllabary that I've talked to you about up till now, and I swear to God, this is the last thing I'm going to show you. It's different in two respects. It has very few syllable elements. And it's been very difficult to translate for Bo and Tom, because it's not statements, it's names. People are writing their name on the wall of the cave. That's not first. But the names are what's curious. They are English names, translated into Cherokee and written in syllabary. English names. Like you would find George Guess in syllabary. You wouldn't. He would have written it with his name. But they did. And there's a number of these all through the cave. There's another one. You recognize those symbols from Dunbar, or from Manitou. In some cases, they're written in English with a date, 1855. 1855. They're long gone by 1855. The removal's finished. But again, syllabary symbols used in English names. As it turns out, though, Cox was a very common name in Oklahoma among Cherokee people. The other names are women for the most part. And all of them were produced using paint, commercially available paint. And that paint, you can see it is the sort of dull, yellow, brownish paint, is all what's called cadmium yellow. Cadmium yellow is a paint that was produced for a very short period of time, that when you used it initially made a very vibrant yellow color, but it deteriorated fairly quickly over time and turned brown. We've done chemical analysis of this, and we're certain that that's what it is. Cadmium yellow was a commercial paint, but was on the market for 2 years, from 1854 to 1856. So somebody, Cherokee, came back to Dunbar Cave from Oklahoma, went to the store, bought the worst paint they could possibly get, and wrote their names on the wall. Why? Because their ancestors had been there. Not the old ones, their grandmother. And they came anyway, because once the Cherokees were in Oklahoma, there was no prescription that they could move around. They could get on a train or a stagecoach and come back. They couldn't live here, but they could certainly come and visit people, their friends. They made material claims to the courts because they had for several decades they had the right to do that. They were not completely gone, they just didn't live here anymore. They thought it important enough, though, to go to the trail that they brought their grandparents on and leave their mark there. So another use of caves as a messaging system from the heart, from the spirit, but at a much later period in time than the inscriptions we've seen before. It's hard to imagine how much of this stuff is out there. I'm getting a little old to go and do this stuff anymore, but Bo's not. The Cherokees are not, and we're working hard to train them up as archaeologists so that it's not just white people that do archaeology of Cherokees anymore, and develop these sort of cooperative avenues so that we can all work together to achieve the kind of richness in understanding the record of the past that I'm talking about here. Let me finish with this very quickly. So this is Bo and Julie in Howard's Waterfall. I think the most important message here, if I was to single one out, is not that they wrote on the cave walls or that it was religious. That's interesting to me, hopefully to you too. What it really highlights, though, is that the history of these people is not done. They are here now. They're not gone. They're in Oklahoma, and for many people who've been to Oklahoma, that's like being gone, but they're not. They have a vibrant culture. They're trying to revitalize the very important aspect of language that is so critical. The archaeological record helps them. They learned, in the context of all of this, for example, about this problem of having different dialects that you had to consider as you looked at this stuff. The lessons are deep. We can get out of it with them, and they're here to help us. I'll say this, for those of you that are archaeologists and are a little timid about this whole idea of consultation, I have never had a negative experience consulting with native people, with descendant people. It's been nothing but happy and pleasurable and rich. Don't avoid it. Do it. And I'll end there. I went over anyway. Thank you. Go ahead. Any questions?
Any questions? Maybe one or two, but Dr. Simic will be available at our reception for one-on-one questions as well.
Yes, ma'am.
You addressed the pigment in the
Charcoal.
All charcoal?
So, you ask me these questions, I'm gonna digress like hell, is what I do. We've studied the paint a lot, because it goes way back in time, and so we're interested to see if there's variability in how they make paint and how they use it, from early times to late times, archaeology question. What we found with paints, especially in the southeast, is that they actually are very simple. There's a chromophore, which is the color, mineral in every case, and there's water. We have looked and looked to find other components that might have been included in these paints, blood, organic material, something, and have never found anything. We have very high resolution spectrometers that we can actually carry into these sites to do this analysis. One of the interesting things about this, and we're just sort of working on this stuff, so to understand this, another PhD student, she's finished now of mine, a woman named Sierra Bow, who is a geochemist, we've been working on doing replicative experiments to try to see how these materials were made and how different materials incorporated might have appeared geochemically, how they might have survived or not geochemically, what the process of use is. One of the things we discovered very early on, so the red, which is the most common pictograph color, is iron oxide, ochre, ground up and mixed with water. The black, we always assumed was charcoal. But when we went to do experiments, we ground the charcoal up, mixed it with water, and it would stick to nothing because charcoal, as it turns out, is not water soluble. So what the hell? What is water soluble? Anybody guess? Is ash. Ash is completely combusted carbon. The carbon's basically gone, and what's left are trace elements in a matrix that will hold them together. And if you mix ash with water, you have a black paint that goes on beautifully thickly across the surface. So they're ash. And one of the things that sort of supports, we never could find carbon when we do these chemical analyses. It's because it's not there. So I suspect that the black is ash mixed with water, at least in the Cherokee inscriptions from early on.
Thank you.
Yes, Ian?
You mentioned the little people, because I'm interested in that. You talked about the cave. Where was that located? Was that in Alabama too? Or
Yes, that's it. That's out. It's in Fort Payne. It's out. It's not very far from Andrew Ross's house. It's on Andrew Ross's property. You want to go?
Yeah.
That's Manitou Cave.
No, Manitou is the first one I talked about. It's not on Andrew Ross's property, but it's in Fort Payne as well. Yes, sir.
So why is it called Manitou Cave? Isn't it Algonquian?
Yes. Because white people named it. I mean, that's what it is. You know, historically, when it began to be converted into a tourist attraction at the end of the 19th century, it was local coal companies that had bought the uplands around Fort Payne and were beginning to mine those uplands that wanted to make sort of tourist fun things for their people to do. So they turned Manitou Cave into a tourist trap, basically, and named it the most Indian thing they could think of. And Crazy Horse things have been bad recently, so they named it Manitou.
So, Jan, can we continue the questions
Absolutely.
over the reception? All right. I hope
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.